News. The federal opposition says WA's decision to increase some mining royalties will leave Wayne Swan with a gaping hole in his budget. The federal government is keeping its promise to reimburse companies for mining royalties because of the introduction of the mineral resources rent tax. But the government says it's Western Australia that will lose out because it'll get a smaller share of GST revenue. For the latest, we cross to Melissa Clarke in Canberra. And Mel, this is turning into a good old stoush between Canberra and a state.
It certainly is. We've got the federal government saying that it's not going to be the loser here, it's going to be WA that ends up worse off, and they're shooting themselves in the foot. And then we've got the WA Premier, Colin Barnett, who says that the federal government is being threatening and abusive and that that's not appropriate. But for a different take on this, I've got joining with me from the studio in Perth, the opposition's Assistant Treasury Spokesman and WA Senator Mathias Cormann. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good to be here.
The opposition says that this move by the WA government is going to blow a hole in the budget. But is $2 billion over 3 years, that's not enough to put the budget back in the red, is it?
Well, Wayne Swan has only got himself to blame for this $2 billion black hole in his budget, and of course it further reduces what is already a paper-thin expected surplus in 2012-13, which we would question in any event.
The reality here, the surplus for 2012-13 is forecast to be around $3.5 billion, but they're only going to have to pay out an extra $324 million, I think it is, for that year because of this change. So it's not that big a difference, is it?
Well, Wayne Swan has delivered 4 successive deficit budgets. This year, the budget position is deteriorating by $8 billion to take the deficit to $50 billion. The next year, it's deteriorating by $10 billion to take the deficit to $22.6 billion. And of course, on the back of the mining tax, Wayne Swan wants us to believe that he's going to have a turnaround the following year. Now, we've had Western Australia make a decision yesterday which reduces the surplus by $2 billion over the forward estimates. What about Queensland and New South Wales? I mean, they can do exactly the same as what Western Australia has done. What this shows is Wayne Swan and Julia Gillard have made a real mess of this mining tax. They did a dodgy deal in secret with the 3 biggest mining companies, excluding their competitors from the process, and importantly also excluding state and territory governments from the process. Now, resource taxation in Australia under our constitution is a matter for state and territory governments. And if any Australian government that wants to pursue genuine and fair income tax reform in the resource taxation area, of course has to negotiate with state and territory governments. This Labor government hasn't done that. They didn't do their homework. They cut corners because they needed the cash for their budget bottom line, and the results are here for all to see. It's one big mess.
This morning, Tony Abbott said that the coalition wouldn't have a change in the tax system, that it's working perfectly fine as it is, and it will in the future, and the mining tax just mucks it up. Is the coalition's position just to remain with the status quo?
Well, we think that this government should scrap the mining tax. It's a bad tax which came out of a bad process. What happens right now is that mining companies pay royalties, which is paying for the cost of the resource on production. Well, I mean, the system as it works very well. We've got royalties, which are essentially a cost for the companies that extract a non-renewable resource, which are paid to the states. And you've, of course, got a tax on profit, which is a company tax, which goes to the federal government. This whole mining tax process was only ever a grab for cash, which the government tried to dress up as tax reform. It wasn't tax reform.
But the industry itself has said that it wants reform, that it doesn't want volume-based taxation as it is with royalties. It would prefer profits-based taxation. So if you're arguing that we should keep the volume-based taxation, aren't you going against what the industry itself is calling for?
Well, I mean, the industry argued, and Ken Henry incidentally recommended that a national profit-based tax should replace state and territory royalties altogether. That is, of course, not what Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan are proposing. They're not proposing a replacement tax. They're proposing a top-up tax. Rather than to simplify our tax system, they're proposing to make our tax system more complex and, of course, impose a multi-billion-dollar additional tax on our mining industry.
The coalition has raised concerns about some of the external factors hitting Australian companies, things like the rising dollar and the impact that has on decisions made and jobs held by big resource companies. Does the fact that the WA government is putting up royalties, is that not against what the coalition would like to see in terms of taking pressure off companies?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, the appropriate return from the extraction of a non-renewable resource in Western Australia is a matter for the West Australian state government. But the point here is that you've got a federal government that has put together a mining tax which was supposed to be about genuine tax reform, and they didn't ever even talk to the state and territory governments that are responsible for resource taxation right now. Now, Wayne Swan's response today was to come out and threaten Western Australia. His response was to declare war, a tax war against the people of Western Australia. What is he going to do in June if the Queensland government does the same as the state government in Western Australia has done today? Is he going to declare war on the people in each and every state where the state government, consistent with their authority under the Constitution, decides to make changes to their royalty arrangements?
There is currently a review underway of the way the GST is distributed between the states. Could the WA government have just held off and waited for the outcome of that review, and it might have found it might not have needed to make this change and put the government in a difficult position?
Well, current GST sharing arrangements are unfair to states like Western Australia, and of course we've pointed that out before. And Julia Gillard's response to that was to set up a review on the Never Never, which is essentially going to lead to some outcomes after the next election. She bought herself some time. The truth of the matter here is that the federal government today, instead of coming out and saying, okay, well, we got this wrong, we see the error of our ways, we know that we should have sat down with state and territory governments to talk these things through with them, they came out and declared a tax war on the people of Western Australia. That's not the way to fix this issue.
That's all we've got time for. Matthias Cormann, thanks for joining us.
Good to talk to you.
And Joe, the mining taxi is well and truly back in the headlines and back on the government's radar, along with some very other burning contentious issues like asylum seekers and carbon pricing.
It definitely is. Melissa Clarke in Canberra, thanks very much.